this is NBS History, and as requested, this episode will be on the lore of Ungoliant, the first great spider in Tolkien's universe. The request came about after my episode on the lore of Shelob. Click here if you'd like to see that first. As a disclaimer, I will be using the first half of this episode to get through the lore, while the second half will be a very specific conversation on what I believe Ungoliant to be. To those not familiar with Tolkien's work, he wrote multiple versions of his stories, and it gets a bit complicated. Ungoliant is a story with a lot of unanswered questions, such as, what was Ungoliant, and was she a Maya? This is one of the largest arguments I know to date on Tolkien's work, and so, without further ado, Ungoliant, the first great spider. Whence she came, none of the Eldar know, but maybe she came to the south, out of the darkness of Ea. In that time when Melkor destroyed the lights of Iluin and Amal, because of his dwelling in the north, the heat of the Valar was turned most thither, and the south was long forgotten. Thence she crept towards the realm of light of the Valar, for she hungered for light and hated it. In a deep cleft of the mountains she dwelt, and took shape, as it were, a spider of monstrous form, sucking up all such light as she could find, or that strayed over the walls of Valinor, and she spun it forth again in black webs of strangling gloom, until no light more could come to her abode, and she was famished. So from the Silmarillion, Ungoliant is the oldest and greatest of the great spiders. It came from the darkness that is within Arda some time, when Melkor first looked down upon in envy of the kingdom of Manwë. Now, the Book of Lost Tales gives us a different origin as follows. Very deep and winding were those ways, having a subterranean outlet on the sea, as the ancient books say, and here dwelt the primeval spirit Moru, whom even the Valar know not whence or when she came. And the folk of earth have given her many names. Mayap, she was bred of myths and darkness, on that the confines of the shadowy seas, in that utter dark that came between the overthrow of the lamps and the kindling of the trees. But more like she has always been, and she is to who loveth still to dwell in that black place, taking the guise of an unlovely spider, spinning and clinging gossamer of gloom that catches in the meshed stars and the moons, and all bright things that sail the airs. So here Ungoliant came as a primeval spirit named Moru, and the Valar did not know where she came from. They think perhaps she came from the darkness of the shadowy seas, but more likely is she has always been. Melkor meets her and other companions. Now, I had to state both tellings of her origin to make a point. The Lost Tales are rudimentary notes that eventually Tolkien reworked, which became the Silmarillion. Thus, from then on, I will use mostly the Silmarillion, and I do continue. So Melkor corrupted Ungoliant and many others during the time he formed a rebellion against the Valar. He destroyed the two lamps, which were the original sources of light for Arda. He built his fortresses of Angband and Utumno, and while the Valar fled to Aman for safety, he used this time to corrupt the awakening of elves. The Valar then declared war on Melkor and defeated him in the Battle of the Powers. Melkor was cast into prison within the halls of Mandos for thousands of years. Ungoliant and the other foul creatures fled the hunters of Oroma during this time to save their lives and to hide from the rest of the Valar. During this time, the two trees of light were planted to replace the lamps. Melkor eventually pleaded enough to be released from his prison, tricking the Valar into thinking he had changed his ways. From then on, he began to cast lies and evil across Arda in secret, until the Valar finally figured this out and that he had not changed. By this time, he had formed a plan for his vengeance on the Valar, and he required the help of an ancient old friend. Thus, unseen he came, at last, to the dark region of Avathar. That narrow land lay south of the Bay of Eldamar, beneath the eastern feet of the Polori, and its long and mournful shores stretched away into the south, lightless and unexplored. There beneath the sheer walls of the mountains and the cold dark sea, the shadows were deepest and the thickest in the world, and there in Avathar, secret and unknown, Ungoliant had made her abode. The Eldar knew not whence she came, but some have said that in the ages long before she descended from the darkness that lies about Arda, when Melkor first looked down in envy upon the kingdom of Manwë, and that in the beginning she was one of those that he corrupted to his service. But she had disowned her master, desiring to be the mistress of her own lust, taking all things to herself to feed her emptiness, and she fled to the south, escaping the assaults of the Valar and the hunters of Orome. For their vigilance had ever been to the north, and the south was long unheeded. Thence she had crept towards the light of the blessed realm, for she hungered for light and hated it. In a ravine she lived, and took shape as a spider of monstrous form, weaving her black webs in a cleft of the mountains. There she sucked up all the light, and that she could find, and spun it forth again in dark nets of strangling gloom, until no light more could come to her abode, and she was famished. So Melkor finds Ungoliant starving for light, and her dark webs which she made from the light she consumed now stopped any light from getting to her. Ungoliant hides from him, terrified, as Melkor says, "I have a need of thee, and I will not be denied. Either thou wilt serve me, or I will bury thee here, and under black stone thou shalt wither into naught." With this he hands the 2 shining gems for her to eat, luring her out of her hiding. Slowly she comes forth to grab the gems, but Melkor says, "Nay, nay, I do not bring thee these elvish sweets in love or pity. They are to strengthen thee when thou hast agreed to do my bidding." "What is your bidding, master?" she says, eyeing the gems. Melkor then tells her of his plan, to have her to destroy the 2 trees of light and consume them. However, she is afraid of the Valar, and deems it far too dangerous, but still she lusts for the light. "Do as I bid, and if thou art still hungry, when we meet again, thou, I vow, I will give to thee whatsoever thy lust may demand, yea, with both hands." Though in his heart he made this vow lightly, for he had no intention of handing over the gems he secretly sought to steal, the Silmarils. With this vow, Ungoliant's lust overcame her fear, and she agreed to destroy the trees of light. A cloak of darkness she wove about them, when Melkor and Ungoliant set forth, an unlight, in which things seemed to be no more, and which eyes could not pierce, for it was a void. Then slowly she wrought her webs, rope by rope, from cleft to cleft, from jutting rock to pinnacle of stone, ever climbing upwards, crawling and clinging, until at last she reached the very summit of Hyumentir, the highest mountain in that region of the world, far south of great Taniquetil. There the Valar were not vigilant, for west of the Pelori was an empty land in the twilight, and eastward the mountains looked out, save for forgotten Avathar, only upon the dim waters of the pathless sea. But now upon the mountain top dark Ungoliant lay, and she made a ladder of woven ropes and cast it down, and Melkor climbed upon it, and came to that high place, and stood beside her, looking down upon the guarded realm. Below them lay the woods of Oroma, and the westward shimmering fields and pastures of Yavanna, gold beneath the tall wheat of the gods. Bat Melkor looked north, and saw afar the shining plain, and the silver domes of Velma, gleaming in the mingling of the lights of Telperion and Lorelin. Then Melkor laughed aloud, and leapt swiftly down the longest western slopes, and Ungoliant was at his side, and her darkness covered them both. Now, while Melkor and Ungoliant made their attack, there was a great festival occurring amongst the Valar. This meant the Valar were all too distracted to notice what was about to occur, until it would be too late. It is told that even as Feonar and Fingolfin stood there before Manwë, there came the mingling of the lights, when both trees were shimmering and the silent city of Alma was filled with a radiance of silver and gold. And in that very hour Melkor and Ungoliant came hastening over the fields of Valinor, as the shadow of a black cloud upon the wind fleets over the sunlight earth. And then they came before the green mound of Ezolaha. Then the unlight of Ungoliant rose up even to the roots of the trees, and Melkor sprang upon the mound, and with his black spear he smote each tree to its core, wounding them deep, and their sap poured forth as if it were blood, and was spilled upon the ground. But Ungoliant sucked it up, and then, going from tree to tree, she set her black beak to their wounds, till they were drained, and the poison of death that was in her went into their tissues and withered them, root, branch, and leaf, and they died. And still she thirsted, and going to the wells of Vada, she drank them dry. But Ungoliant belched forth black vapors as she drank, and swelled to a shape so vast and hideous that Melkor was afraid. So great the darkness fell upon Valinor. Of the deeds of that day much is told in the Eldunadi, that Elmer of the Vanya made and is known to all the Eldar. Yet no song or tale could contain all the grief and terror that then befell. The light failed, but the darkness that followed was more than loss of light. In that hour was made a darkness that seemed not lack but a thing with being of its own, for it was indeed made by the malice of light, and it had power to pierce the eye, and enter the heart and mind, and strangle the very will. So Ungoliant used her cover of darkness to escape from the Valar with Melkor, but they made a side detour on their way. Melkor goes to Fëanor's fortress called Fermennos, where he kills Fanwë and steals the Silmarils and other great gems. After this, the Valar still hunting them, Melkor and Ungoliant flee further. Meanwhile, Morgoth, escaping from the pursuit of the Valar, came to the waste of Arman. This land lay northward between the mountains of the Pelori and the Great Sea, as Avathar lay to the south. But Ahriman was a Wada land, and between the shores and the mountains were barren plains, ever colder as the ice drew nearer. Through this region Morgoth and Ungoliant passed in haste, as so came through the great mists of Oyama to the Helcarax, where the strait between Ahriman and Middle-earth was filled with the grinding ice, and he crossed over, and he came back at last to the north of the outer lands. Together they went on, for Morgoth could not elude Ungoliant, and her cloud was still about him, and all her eyes were upon him. And they came to those lands that lay north of the Firth of Dragons. Now Morgoth was drawing near to the ruins of Angband, where his great western stronghold had been, and Ungoliant perceived his hope, and knew that here he would seek to escape from her, and she stayed him, demanding that he fulfill his promise. "Black head," she said, "I have done thy bidding, but I hunger still." "What wouldst thou have more?" said Morgoth. "Dost thou desire all the world for thy belly? I did not vow to give thee that. I am its lord." "Not so much," said Ungoliant, "but thou hast a great treasure from Fermennos, and I will have all of that. Yea, with both hands thou shalt give it." Then perforce Morgoth surrendered to her the gems that he bore with him, one by one and grudgingly, and she devoured them, and their beauty perished from the world. Huger and darker yet she grew. Ungoliant, but her lust was unsated. "With one hand thou givest," she said, "with the left only. Open thy right hand." In his right hand Morgoth held close the Silmarils, and though they were locked in a crystal casket, they had begun to burn him, and his hand was clenched in pain, but he would not open it. "Nay," he said, "thou hast had thy doe, for with my power that I put into thee thy work was accomplished. I need thee no more. These things thou shalt not have, nor see. I have them unto myself forever." Do you notice how Ungoliant went from calling Melkor master to insulting him with terms such as blackhead? She does not fear Melkor any longer, and certainly holds no allegiance to him. Also, for those of you scratching your heads a bit, this is more of the Lost Tales version rather than the Silmarillion. I had to use it just because the dialogue is just so much better. But Ungoliant had grown great, and he less by the power that he had gone out of him. And she rose against him, and her cloud closed about him, and she enmeshed him in a web of clinging thongs to strangle him. Then Morgoth sent forth a terrible cry that echoed in the mountains. Therefore that region was called Lamath, for the echoes of his voice dwelt there ever after, so that any who cried aloud in that land awoke in them. And all the waste between the hills and the sea was filled with a clamour as of voices in anguish. The cry of Morgoth in that hour was the greatest and most dreadful that had ever heard in the northern world. The mountains shook, and the earth trembled, and the rocks were riven asunder. Deep in forgotten places that cry was heard, far beneath the ruined halls of Angband, in vaults to which the Valar, in the haste of their assault, had not descended. Balrogs lurked still, awaiting ever the return of their lord, and now swiftly they arose, passing over the Hithlum, and they came to Lamath as a tempest of fire. With their whips of flame they smote asunder the webs of Ungoliant, and she quailed and turned to flight, belched black vapours to cover her. And fleeing from the north, she went down into Beleriand, and dwelt beneath arid Golgoroth, in that dark valley that was after called Nan Dungutheb, the valley of dreadful death, because of the horror that she bred there. For other foul creatures of spider form had dwelt there since the days the dwelling of Angband, and she mated with them, and devoured them. And even after Ungoliant herself departed, and went whither she would into the forgotten south of the world, her offspring abode there, and wove their hideous webs. Of the fate of Ungoliant no tale tells, yet some have said that she ended long ago, when in her uttermost famine she devoured herself at last. Okay, so at last Ungoliant disappears from the world of Arda, supposedly having consumed herself to death. Now comes the argument over what was Ungoliant. The main argument, honestly, as the fan know, is whether or not she was of the Maya. This argument largely exists because of the contradictions that the rest of the Silmarillion and the Lost Tales have of her story. I will present the best evidence for both sides, and then I'll pitch in what I believe. So, if Ungoliant is a Maya, the best evidence would probably come from the Silmarillion. Note that the Silmarillion part of Ungoliant is not as old as the Lost Tales, and they were more or less built off of unfinished notes. It says that the Eldar did not know of her origin, that she came from out of the darkness that lays within Arda. She eventually took the form of a great spider, mated and had offspring such as Shelob. It is also believed she was of those corrupted into service by Melkor, and that being the best evidence in favor for her being a Maya would be that part. Some others have pointed out that Maiar can't have offspring as Ungoliant did. I found this in a few YouTube videos, but that's completely false, as the Maya and elves mated, and Luthien is created through this process. Okay, and for the other side of the argument, her not being of the Maya, which is what I am going to argue. Here I'll use just a piece from the Lost Tales. Here dwelt the primeval spirit Moru, whom even the Valar know not whence or when she came, and the folk of earth have given her many names. Maya, she was bred of mists and darkness on the confines of the shadowy seas, and that utter dark that came between the overthrow of the lamps and the kindling of the trees, but more like she has always been. So from here you already see there's some major differences. The Valar did not know of her origin. She comes from a more obscure darkness. Many secondary sources, that being other YouTubers and such, state this darkness is a void or a darkness that's outside Arda. However, as hard as I tried to find a real source on this, I could not. So I'm not going to account for that too much. Now, what's so important about pointing out the differences of the sources, you might ask? Here's my big argument. The Silmarillion is written as if by elves. So of course, the Eldar knew not where she came from, nor would they know if the Valar knew where she came from. Am I confusing you a bit? Basically, the Silmarillion does not contradict the Lost Tales, for it's written as if it's a retelling by the elves, allowing the Lost Tales to be credible. Or another word for it would be canon, but that would be kind of weird to say. Anyways, also, it's pointed out by countless fans. Tom Bombadil, yes, the weird guy that simply does not fit into the world of Arda at all exists. Thus, if Tom Bombadil exists, why can't Ungoliant? And in fact, how well would that work out in the first place, these two existing? Imagine Ungoliant as the counterbalance to Tom Bombadil. Sort of like, a light against darkness feature. It kind of makes a lot of sense if you think about it. Also, Ungoliant has unique abilities, such as her unlight. She does not simply suck up light and cause darkness. It's specifically stated the darkness she forms is literally consumed light being harnessed with malice and put forth in webs and clouds. This unlight is different from the absence of light, making her seem more like a primeval spirit, the embodiment of darkness and hatred itself. She's also not listed amongst the Arnor, and I have a really hard time imagining that Tolkien would not have gone on and added another 20 pages describing her amongst them and various stories of her before she took a spider's form and such. Same goes for Tom Bombadil. Lastly, and I know this one annoys fans and is not the most credible, but I have to mention it. She beat up Melkor. I mean, straight up, like, she embarrassed him. So a supposed Maya, a lesser to, Melkor of Valinor, gets beaten. I know Melkor is a bit of a wussy and he's afraid of quite a few other people, which is hilarious, but it just seemed a little odd to me that she's able to do this. Also, why doesn't Melkor suck up or consume the light of the trees himself to become big and powerful? Why did he specifically get Ungoliant to do this? Is this a unique ability of hers? Because Shelob is certainly not capable of this in any sense. Look at how she reacted to the light of Arundel, which holds the very same light and essence of the trees. Now I'm very humbled if you've made it this far in listening to this episode, and honestly thank you from the bottom of my heart. I take a lot of pleasure in making this content. If you could please, it would help greatly. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. We have a great need for subscribers to build this channel, and I would like to do a lot more projects in the future. Now, you probably noticed that I am definitely not a Tolkien channel. It's a history channel, and that might seem a little odd, but to be honest, most historians and people I've studied with are avid Tolkien fans as well, as am I, and that's why I went forward to do this. Stating this, moving forward, I would like to allude to some of the work that I'm thinking about doing. I have decided that because there are other channels that do such a better job than me, for instance, Men of the West, I've listened to it for years, it's quite great, and it drew a lot of inspirations. I simply don't want to just forward you the same information that they're giving you. So I'm going to try and take a different aspect of Tolkien's work. I am going to write and produce content about the real history behind a lot of Tolkien's events and battles. To give you just a tidbit, the upcoming episode that I'll do in the future that'll touch on Tolkien will be about the Winged Huzzas. That's just to give you a little tidbit. Other than that, this has been NBS History. Thank you for listening, and again, please help the channel and subscribe, and leave all of your comments and how much you probably want to argue me about the whole Maya thing. Please, go ahead. I can't wait to listen because, honestly, it's a great argument. Goodbye.